Hey everyone, and welcome back to Thunga's Storytime. Tonight, we're not just telling a story, we're ripping a chilling chapter straight from the history books, a time when an invisible enemy wiped out nearly half the planet. We're talking about the Black Death, unimaginable terror, society crumbling, and a desperate fight for survival. But what if I told you that amidst this apocalypse, some individuals walked through the fire unscathed? Not just by chance, but because of a hidden secret locked deep within their DNA, a biological superpower forged in plague, that, incredibly, still protects some of us today from entirely different modern killers. Join me as we uncover tales of heartbreaking loss, unbelievable sacrifice, and the shocking ways humanity endured, adapted, and was forever changed. This story is wilder than fiction. You don't want to miss it. You're morning in 1347. The first thing that hits you is the air. It's crisp, maybe a little raw, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. You're lying on something that rustles and pricks a bit, a straw-filled mattress. It's a far cry from the pillow-top comfort you're used to. As your eyes adjust to the dim light filtering in from a small, unglazed window or an open doorway, you realize you're not alone. Not by a long shot. This isn't your private sanctuary, it's a single, cramped room, and you're sharing it with your entire family. Parents, siblings, maybe even a grandparent if they've been lucky enough to see old age in an era where that was a true achievement. Privacy, as you understand it, simply doesn't exist here. Life is a communal affair, lived out loud, in close quarters, a huddle of humanity against the harshness of the world. Home, such as it is, the medieval peasant dwelling. Your house is a testament to making do with what nature provides. The walls are a sturdy, if somewhat lumpy, creation of wattle and daub, basically a wooden latticework frame. The wattle, packed cool with a thick mixture of mud, clay, straw, and maybe even animal dung. The daub. It's surprisingly good insulation against the bone-chilling European winters, but it's not exactly airtight. Drafts are a constant companion. Overhead, a thick thatched roof of reeds or straw does its best to keep the elements out, but a heavy downpour often means a strategic placement of pots and pans to catch the inevitable drips. It's just another part of the soundtrack of life. The floor beneath your bare feet isn't hardwood or tile, it's packed earth, smoothed and hardened by generations of use. It's cool to the touch, and it carries that same earthy scent as the air outside. In the center of the room, or against one wall, is the hearth, the heart of the home. It's where the cooking happens, where the family gathers for warmth, and where a fire likely smoldered all night, filling the room with a perennial haze of wood smoke that stings the eyes and lines the lungs. There are no closets overflowing with clothes, no shelves on gulo with knickknacks. Possessions are few and precious, a cooking pot, some wooden bowls and spoons, rough woolen blankets, and the tools of your family's trade. This isn't a home designed for comfort in the modern sense, but for basic shelter and survival. An air of shared sense, hygiene, or lack thereof. As you move about, you become aware of a complex tapestry of odors. Beyond the wood smoke and the damp earth, there's an undeniable human aroma. Let's be frank, bathing is not a daily, weekly, or even monthly ritual for most people. It's a massive undertaking. Water has to be hauled, often from a distance, and then heated over the precious fire, a significant expenditure of time and fuel. And for what? Prevailing medical thought, such as it was, sometimes even cautioned against too much bathing, believing it could open the body's pores to disease-carrying miasmas or bad air. So, a splash of cold water on the face and hands might be the extent of it. The result is that everyone carries a certain ripeness. But here's the thing. When everyone smells pretty much the same, it becomes unnoticeable, the baseline. It's not a source of shame or social awkwardness, it's just the way things are. This lack of sanitation, however, has far more serious implications than just smell. The village well or local stream, the primary sources of drinking water, are often dangerously contaminated with human and animal waste. Dysentery, typhoid, and a host of other waterborne illnesses are rampant and frequently lethal, especially for infants and young children. A simple cut or scrape could easily become infected, with no antibiotics to halt its deadly progression. Life is a constant, low-grade battle against unseen microbial enemies. Fueling the body, the medieval diet. That familiar pang of hunger in your belly is a daily call to action. Breakfast, if you can call it that, won't be a stack of pancakes or a bowl of sugary cereal. If you're fortunate, there's some bread left over from the previous day. This isn't artisan sourdough, it's dense, coarse bread, likely made from rye or barley, and by now, it's probably as hard as a stone. The common solution? Dunk it in your morning drink. Ale. Yes, ale. Even for the kids. Before you imagine a village of perpetually tipsy toddlers, understand that this small ale or weak ale had a very low alcohol content. Crucially, the brewing process involved boiling the water, which killed off many of the dangerous pathogens that made untreated water a gamble with your life. So, ale wasn't just a beverage, it was often a safer, more nutritious, providing much-needed calories, alternative to the local water supply. The diet itself is a testament to subsistence. For the vast majority, it's overwhelmingly grain-based. Pottage, a thick, often bland, stew of boiled grains and whatever vegetables were available, peas, beans, onions, cabbage from the cottage garden, is a daily staple. Bread is constant. Meat is a rare treat, perhaps a bit of bacon from the family pig if they were lucky enough to own one, or game poached from the Lord's forest at great personal risk. Fruits are seasonal and fleeting. Every mouthful represents hours of back-breaking labor in the fields, a constant struggle to coax enough sustenance from the earth to see the family through another day, another season. The unwavering pulse of village life. For most people in 1347, the village is their entire world. The day begins with the sounds of this world awakening, the crowing of roosters, the lowing of oxen being yoked for the fields, the clucking of hens, the distant shouts of neighbors. Society is rigidly structured. Most are peasants, their lives dictated by their relationship to the land and to the local lord of the manor. Some might be free tenants, who pay rent for the land they farm. Many more are serfs, tied to the estate by birth, owing their lord a hefty portion of their labor, working his fields, maintaining his property, before they can even think about tending the small plots allocated for their own survival. Freedom, as you might define it, is a distant dream. The rhythms of life are ancient and unvarying, dictated not by clocks or calendars on your phone, but by the natural world. The sun governs the workday. The church bells mark the passage of time and call the faithful to Mass, a cornerstone of spiritual life and a key social event, where news and gossip are exchanged alongside prayers. The year unfolds in a predictable agricultural cycle, the plowing and sowing of spring, the tending and weeding of summer, the crucial harvest of autumn that determines whether the village will eat or starve through the long winter, and then the lean, cold months of winter itself, a time for repair, reflection, and waiting for the earth to reawaken. The known world, the unimagined cataclysm. It is, without a doubt, a life of immense hardship, a daily grind against poverty, hunger, and disease. Yet, it is the only life known. It's the framework of existence, passed down through generations, imbued with a sense of unchanging permanence. People accept their lot, finding solace in family, community, and faith. The idea of a world fundamentally different from this one is almost inconceivable. But what you, standing there in the smoky dimness of your 1347 cottage, cannot possibly comprehend is that the very foundations of this world are about to shatter. An unseen, unstoppable force is already on the move, a creeping shadow making its way along the arteries of trade, from the distant east towards the heart of Europe. This ordinary morning, with its familiar discomforts and routines, is a moment of profound ignorance, a deceptive calm before a storm of unimaginable fury. The life you know, the world you inhabit, is on the brink of a transformation so brutal and so complete that it will redefine the course of human history. The Black Death is coming, a world oblivious. That hard-won normalcy, that comforting rhythm of seasons and church bells, is fragile, more fragile than anyone can comprehend. Across the vast expanse of Europe, and even further east, a calamity is brewing, a storm of pestilence gathering strength far beyond your horizon. In an age without instant communication, without newspapers or radio, news travels at the speed of a horse or a sailing ship, often arriving distorted, weeks or months late, if at all. A disaster could decimate a distant city, and your village might remain blissfully, tragically unaware until the ripples finally reached your isolated shore. You and your neighbors go about your lives, tilling the fields, tending the hearth, completely oblivious to the monstrous wave of death that has already begun its relentless march across the continents. Whispers on the wind, the merchant's dreadful cargo. The first hint of trouble arrives, as news often does, on the lips of a traveling merchant. These hardy souls are the lifeblood of medieval trade, the threads connecting isolated communities. Their arrival is usually a welcome event, a break in the monotony, a chance to see exotic goods, gleaming silks from the fabled East, pungent spices from lands you can only dream of, perhaps a new tool or a trinket. They bring with them not just wares, but stories, a glimpse of the wider world. But this time, the merchant who trundles into your village square, his cart laden with the usual assortment of goods, carries something far more unsettling than bolts of cloth or sacks of pepper. His eyes, usually bright with the prospect of trade, are shadowed with a weariness that goes beyond the road. As he unloads his wares, and later, perhaps over a mug of ale at the rudimentary village inn or around a communal fire, he shares stories. Not tales of bustling markets or prosperous cities, but terrifying accounts of a strange, devastating sickness that has been laying waste to communities along the great trade routes he has just traversed. He speaks of cities where people are dying by the thousands, struck down by a mysterious illness that begins with a raging fever, followed by excruciatingly painful swellings in the groin, armpits, or neck, and then, almost invariably, a swift and agonizing death. His voice is low, his words painting pictures of chaos and despair that are hard for you and your fellow villagers to reconcile with your own relatively stable existence. The reactions are mixed. Some of the older folks, their faces etched with the memory of past hardships, quickly cross themselves, muttering prayers to God and the saints for protection. A palpable unease settles over those who listen intently. Others, particularly the younger or more pragmatic, dismiss the tales as exaggerations, the kind of grim stories travelers often embellish to make their journeys seem more perilous and their own survival more heroic. Alarming rumors, one might say, always spread faster than truth. After all, life in your village has its own share of sickness and death. What could be so different, so much worse, than what you already know? The merchant eventually packs up and moves on, a harbinger of doom disappearing down a dusty track, leaving behind his goods in a disturbing seed of anxiety that begins to sprout in the fertile ground of uncertainty. The creeping dread, rumors solidify into terror. For a while, life in your village attempts to resume its normal course. The fields are tended, the animals cared for, the daily chores performed. But the merchant's stories linger, an unsettling echo in the back of people's minds. And they are not isolated tales. As the weeks turn into months, as summer fades into the cooler, shorter days of autumn, more whispers arrive. Other travelers, perhaps a pilgrim returning from a distant shrine or wandering friar, bring similar, increasingly dire reports. The rumors are no longer vague or distant, they are becoming more frequent, more detailed, and far more frightening. Then, the whispers transform into shouts of alarm. The news is no longer second-hand from far-flung lands. The sickness, they say, has reached the great Mediterranean ports, Messina in Sicily, the bustling harbors of Marseille, the grand canals of Venice. These are not mythical cities from a merchant's tale, these are known hubs of commerce, places that feel tangibly connected to your world, even if you've never seen them. And the stories coming from these ports are the stuff of nightmares. Tales circulate of death ships drifting into harbors, their sails askew, their decks silent. When brave or desperate port officials finally board them, they find nothing but corpses, the entire crew having perished during their voyage, the ships themselves becoming floating coffins, delivering their pestilential cargo to unsuspecting shores. God save us all, your mother murmurs one evening, her voice trembling as she hears the latest horrifying news from a neighbor who heard it from someone else. She makes the sign of the cross, her eyes wide with a fear that is now raw and immediate. The denial that had offered a fragile shield begins to crumble. This is not just a story. This is real. And it is coming closer. Bracing for an unknown enemy, futile preparations. Faced with a threat they cannot see or understand, The people of your village begin to prepare as best they can, though no one really knows what they're preparing for. Some families, driven by a primal instinct for survival, start to store extra food, a little more grain set aside, a few more dried vegetables. If the sickness comes, they reason, perhaps they can barricade themselves in, outlast the danger. Others turn with renewed, almost desperate, fervor to their faith. Attendance at Mass increases. Prayers for divine protection, for deliverance from this unseen scourge, become longer, more impassioned. Perhaps, they hope, if they are pious enough, if they appease God's wrath, for surely, many believe, such a calamity must be a sign of divine displeasure, their village will be spared. The local healer, often an older woman with a deep knowledge of traditional herbal remedies passed down through generations, becomes a focal point of anxious hope. She gathers herbs from the fields and forests, brews poultices and concoctions, her hands working tirelessly, though her eyes likely hold the same uncertainty as everyone else's. Will any of these familiar remedies be effective against this new, unknown affliction? She can only try, relying on the ancient wisdom of her craft, a fragile shield against an invisible, overwhelming force. There's a poignant sense of helplessness in these preparations, a community throwing every meager resource, every belief, every prayer they possess at an enemy whose nature and strength are a complete mystery. The plague at your doorstep, a neighbor's agony. The cold months of winter arrive, bringing with them not a respite, but an even more chilling reality. The news, when it comes, is no longer from distant ports or even neighboring regions. It's from a village just half a day's walk away, a place where you might have relatives, or where you've traded goods at market. They report several sudden, terrifying deaths. The descriptions of the illness from this nearby community are stark and horrifyingly consistent. The victims suffer sudden, raging high fevers. They complain of a terrible, unquenchable thirst. And then, the most grotesque and terrifying sign, strange, dark, swollen lumps, the buboes, erupt in their armpits, their groin, or on their necks. These swellings are said to be excruciatingly painful. Few who exhibit these symptoms survive more than 3 days. Death is swift, brutal, and seemingly inescapable. The psychological impact of this news is devastating. The enemy is no longer a rumor or a distant threat. It is, quite literally, at your doorstep. The village elders convene in hushed, anxious meetings. What can be done? Some suggest closing the village entirely to all outsiders, creating a self-imposed quarantine. Others argue that trade and communication must continue, that to cut themselves off would be a slower, different kind of death from starvation or lack of essential goods. In the end, life usually goes on, but now it's overlaid with a thick, suffocating blanket of fear. Every stranger is viewed with suspicion, every cough or sneeze sends a jolt of anxiety through those nearby. The first blow, it's here. Then, one crisp, ordinary morning, the fragile illusion of safety shatters completely. It begins not with a dramatic announcement, but with a simple, unsettling absence. A young man, strong and hardworking, who toils at the village mill, fails to appear for his duties. This is unusual. He's known for his reliability. Concern ripples through his small circle. Someone is sent to check on him at his small cottage. What they find is the moment your village's worst nightmare becomes undeniable reality. The young man is not merely unwell, he is burning with an unnatural fever, his body drenched in sweat despite the cool morning air. And there, on his neck, exposed and angry, is a painful, swollen, dark lump, a bubo, the size of a hen's egg. The words, when they spread through the village, are like a death knell, the plague. It's here. There's no more room for skepticism, no more clinging to the hope that your village might be spared. The monster has breached the walls. The shock is palpable, a wave of cold terror washing over every man, woman, and child. The unleashing, a torrent of death. What follows is a descent into a kind of hell on earth. A period of horror unlike anything you or anyone in your village could have possibly imagined. The sickness, now unleashed within your community, spreads with frightening, almost supernatural, speed. One day, a person is healthy, going about their tasks, perhaps even laughing with friends. The next day, they are struck down by the raging fever. By the third day, more often than not, they are dead. The black buboes, those grotesque harbingers of doom that give the disease its infamous name, the Black Death, are described as being painful beyond description. They swell and harden, the skin stretching taut and turning a horrifying blackish purple. But this is not the only face of the killer. Some victims don't develop the prominent buboes. Instead, they begin to cough blood, a sign that the disease has invaded their lungs, causing a pneumonic form of the plague. These unfortunates rarely last more than a day or two. And worse, this form of the plague is terrifyingly contagious, spreading directly from person to person through the very air they breathe, through coughs and labored exhalations. Daily life, as you knew it, ceases to exist. The routines, the work, the small social interactions, all are consumed by the overwhelming reality of death and the desperate, often futile, struggle to survive. The village becomes a place of whispers, of frantic, whispered prayers, of the cries of the dying, and the keening of the bereaved. It is a world turned upside down, where the only certainty is the relentless, indiscriminate advance of an invisible, all-powerful enemy, the terror of the unknown. This isn't like a war, where you can see your enemy. It's not like a famine, where the cause, however harsh, is understood. This is different. This is a specter, a phantom menace that seeps through walls and spares no one, rich or poor, sinner or saint. This profound ignorance, this utter lack of understanding, is a breeding ground for a desperate, frantic search for answers, any answers, that might make sense of the unfolding horror and, just maybe, offer a sliver of hope for survival. In the face of such overwhelming and inexplicable death, the human mind scrambles, grasping at straws, trying to impose some kind of order on the chaos. God's terrible judgment, the weight of sin. In a world steeped in faith, where the Church's teachings permeate every aspect of life, the most immediate and widely accepted explanation comes crashing down with the weight of divine authority. This is God's punishment. It must be. Humanity, in its wickedness, its greed, its endless capacity for sin, has finally provoked the Almighty's wrath. Sermons thunder from the pulpits of those priests who haven't yet succumbed or fled, painting vivid pictures of biblical plagues, calling for repentance, for a turning away from worldly evils. The air itself seems thick with a sense of collective guilt. This belief ignites a firestorm of desperate piety. The most extreme and visually arresting manifestation of this is the rise of the flagellants. Imagine groups of men, sometimes women too, parading from town to town, their faces grim, their eyes burning with a fervent, almost mad, light. Stripped to the waist, they march in solemn procession, chanting mournful hymns and prayers. And in their hands, they carry brutal whips, often with multiple leather thongs tipped with sharp pieces of metal or bone. As they walk, they scourge themselves, lashing their own backs and shoulders with a rhythmic, sickening thud, until their flesh is raw and blood streams down their bodies. They believe that by inflicting this suffering upon themselves, by sharing in Christ's passion, they can atone for their own sins and the sins of the world, thereby appeasing God's anger and staying the hand of the plague. When these grim processions enter a village like yours, they create a sensation. People flock to watch, a mixture of awe, horror, and a desperate hope that perhaps this extreme devotion will work. Some are inspired to join their ranks. For a time, the flagellants are a powerful, if unsettling, force across parts of Europe. However, their increasingly radical claims, sometimes challenging the authority of the Church itself by suggesting their penance could bypass the need for sacraments, eventually lead to their condemnation by Pope Clement VI, and the movement is suppressed, often violently. For others, the response is less extreme but no less desperate. Endless prayers, solemn public processions carrying holy relics through the streets, an increase in charitable acts, a frantic clinging to every ritual and sacrament the Church offers. Yet, a gnawing doubt begins to creep in. If this is truly God's judgment on sinners, why are innocent children dying in their mothers' arms? Why are devout monks and nuns, who have dedicated their lives to God, perishing in their cloisters at an alarming rate? The plague's cruel impartiality begins to sow seeds of a spiritual crisis that will have long-lasting repercussions. The poisoned air, fleeing the miasma. Alongside the theological explanations, another powerful theory takes hold: the concept of miasma, or bad air. The idea is that the plague is carried on foul, corrupted, or poisoned air, emanating from decaying organic matter, stagnant swamps, unburied corpses, or even from unfavorable astrological alignments or earthquakes that release noxious vapors from the earth. You can't see it, but you can sometimes smell its supposed precursors, the stench of rot, of filth. This belief leads to a host of preventative measures, all aimed at purifying the air or creating a protective barrier against these invisible, airborne poisons. People start carrying posies, small bouquets of strong-smelling flowers like roses or violets, or bunches of aromatic herbs such as rosemary, lavender, or thyme, holding them to their noses when venturing out, especially in crowded areas or near the sick. The nursery rhyme "Ring Around the Rosy," with its pocket full of posies, is thought by some to be a grim echo of this practice. Bonfires are lit in the streets, not just for warmth, but to burn fragrant woods like juniper or pine, or even less pleasant but strong-smelling substances like leather, sulfur, or gunpowder, in the hope that the smoke will cleanse the air. Inside homes, people burn incense, sprinkle vinegar, or hang bundles of herbs. The iconic plague doctor's costume, which evolves over subsequent outbreaks, with its long robe and bird-like mask with a beak stuffed full of aromatic herbs, is a direct product of this miasma theory, an attempt to breathe filtered, safe air. People are advised to avoid marshy areas, south-facing windows, believed to let in harmful winds, and, of course, the homes of the sick, not necessarily because of direct contagion as we understand it, but because the air itself in those places is deemed to be lethal. While these efforts are tragically ineffective against the true culprits, bacteria and fleas, they represent a desperate attempt to exert some control over an uncontrollable situation, based on the best, albeit flawed, understanding of the time. The hunt for a human cause, scapegoating and persecution. When prayers seem to go unanswered and the posies offer no protection, the human psyche, desperate for a tangible cause, often turns to a darker impulse, finding someone to blame. In times of overwhelming fear and societal breakdown, it's a tragically common response to identify a scapegoat, a group onto whom all the fear and anger can be projected. Throughout Europe, dark, insidious whispers begin to circulate: the Jews are poisoning the wells. This accusation, utterly baseless and irrational, falls on fertile ground. Anti-Semitism has a long, ugly history in Christian Europe, fueled by religious intolerance, economic resentment, as Jews were often forced into money lending, a practice forbidden to Christians but essential for commerce, and deeply ingrained superstitions. Jewish communities, often living apart and maintaining distinct customs, are easy targets for suspicion and hatred. The fact that the plague kills Jews just as indiscriminately as Christians matters little to those consumed by panic and prejudice. The fact that many afflicted towns and villages, like yours, have no Jewish residents at all, making the accusation logically absurd, is also ignored. Rumors, fanned by fear and demagoguery, take on a life of their own, spreading like wildfire. Stories are concocted of elaborate Jewish conspiracies to wipe out Christendom. The result is a horrifying wave of violence. Across the Rhine Valley, in France, Switzerland, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, Jewish communities are attacked, their members accused, tortured into false confessions, and then massacred, often burned alive en masse. Thousands perish, not from the plague, but from human cruelty born of terror and ignorance. Even though Pope Clement VI issues papal bulls denouncing the violence and refuting the accusations, the persecutions continue, a shameful testament to humanity's capacity for brutality when gripped by fear. The hidden truth, a microscopic menace, a necessary aside. But here's the tragic irony, the truth that no one in the 14th century could possibly know: the Black Death isn't the wrath of God, nor is it miasma, nor a conspiracy. It's caused by a microscopic bacterium called Yersinia pestis. This tiny organism lives in the digestive tracts of fleas. These fleas, in turn, are commonly found on rats, particularly the black rat, a species that thrives in the unsanitary conditions of medieval towns and villages and travels extensively as a stowaway on merchant ships. When an infected flea bites a rat, it ingests the bacteria. When that rat dies, as they often do from the plague themselves, the hungry flea seeks a new host. If that new host is a human, the flea bites, and in the process, regurgitates Yersinia pestis into the tiny wound. Once inside the human body, the bacteria multiply with terrifying speed, overwhelming the immune system and often causing the characteristic swelling of the lymph nodes, those painful buboes in the neck, armpits, or groin. If the bacteria reach the lungs, they cause pneumonic plague, which can then spread directly from person to person through infected droplets expelled by coughing or even breathing. But you, in your plague-stricken village in 1347, you don't know any of this. All you know is that people are dying, and no one seems to be able to stop it. The world turned upside down, society unravels. Your village, like thousands of others, is fundamentally transformed, warped into a grotesque caricature of its former self. The church bells, which once marked the hours, called people to prayer, and joyfully celebrated weddings and festivals, now toll almost constantly, a mournful, unending dirge for the dead. Eventually, there are simply too many deaths to announce, too few strong arms left to pull the heavy bell ropes, or perhaps the sound itself becomes an unbearable reminder of the omnipresent grief. And so, the bells often fall silent, an even more terrifying sound, an auditory vacuum reflecting the emptying of life from the community. The elaborate funeral rites, so important in medieval society for honoring the dead, ensuring their soul's safe passage to the afterlife, and providing comfort to the bereaved, are among the first casualties. There is no time, no manpower, and frankly, too much fear of contagion for proper burials. Gone are the solemn processions, the lengthy masses for the dead, the careful preparation of the body. Now, the dead are collected with grim efficiency, often on rough carts, their bodies piled unceremoniously, and taken to hastily dug mass graves on the outskirts of the village, vast, open pits where dozens, sometimes hundreds, are interred together with little or no ceremony. In many homes, the horror is even more intimate. Entire families are wiped out within days, leaving no one to tend to the sick or bury the dead. Bodies might lie in their beds or on the cottage floor for days, decomposing, until neighbors, driven by a desperate sense of duty or the unbearable stench, or what remains of parish authority, arrange for their removal. Fear, raw and primal, reshapes human behavior, shredding the very fabric of community and kinship. Those fortunate enough to still have healthy family members might barricade their doors, refusing entry to anyone, even desperate relatives or friends seeking help. The sick often find themselves utterly alone, avoided, ostracized, their cries for water or comfort going unanswered. The bonds of love and duty, so central to medieval life, snap under the unbearable pressure of self-preservation. Some people, their nerve broken, choose flight. They flee their homes, their villages, their plague-ridden towns, hoping that distance will offer protection. They head for the countryside, for isolated areas, for anywhere that seems safer than the charnel house their community has become. Tragically, these fugitives often carry the invisible seeds of the plague with them, unwittingly spreading the contagion to new, previously untouched areas. And what of the clergy, the spiritual shepherds meant to guide and comfort their flock in this time of ultimate crisis? They too are decimated. Their duties require them to be in close contact with the dying, administering last rites, offering prayers, exposing them constantly to the contagion. Many priests and monks die heroically at their posts, true to their vows. But many others, facing the same terror as their parishioners, succumb to fear. They abandon their churches, their congregations, their sacred duties, fleeing for their own lives. This abandonment, understandable though it might be on a human level, deals a devastating blow to the community's morale and its faith, leaving people feeling utterly forsaken, both by God and by his earthly representatives. Adrift in an ocean of death, the reign of helplessness. The overwhelming, soul-crushing reality is that nothing seems to work. The prayers feel hollow as the death toll mounts. The herbal remedies are useless. The attempts to purify the air are futile. The leaders, both secular and religious, are either dead, have fled, or are as powerless as everyone else. Your village, once a place of predictable rhythms and close-knit community, is now a landscape of fear, grief, and utter helplessness, adrift in an ocean of death, its familiar world shattered beyond recognition. Life and death in a plague-stricken world. In a world where the Black Death is scything through the population, indiscriminately felling rich and poor, young and old, sinner and saint, the very concept of luck becomes a terrifyingly fragile thing. You see it all around you in your village, entire families vanishing in a matter of days, their cottages standing silent and empty. You hear the heartbreaking cries of children orphaned one day, only to succumb to the same relentless sickness themselves a few days later. You witness lovers, their vows of eternal devotion still fresh on their lips, torn apart by a fever and a telltale swelling in a matter of hours. Wealth offers no shield. The lord of the manor, in his stone house on the hill, mourns his wife and two of his children, his privilege rendered meaningless against this invisible enemy. Your own family, so far, has been spared. It feels like walking a tightrope over an abyss, each day of health a small, precarious victory. But you know, with a chilling certainty that gnaws at your gut, that this luck is a fickle thing. In a world where this pestilence is claiming a third, perhaps even half, of everyone you know, it's not a matter of if it will strike close to home, but when. The dread is a constant companion, a cold knot in your stomach that tightens with every distant church bell tolling for another soul. When luck runs out, the plague strikes home. Then, one morning, the tightrope snaps. Your younger brother, usually a bundle of energy and mischief, complains of feeling unwell. A wave of cold fear washes over you and your parents. At first, there's a desperate, unspoken hope, maybe it's just a chill, a passing ailment. But by midday, he's burning with a fever that rages like an inferno, his small body trembling. And by evening, the dreaded sign appears, the one that has become synonymous with a death sentence. A tender, angry swelling begins to emerge on the side of his neck. There's no mistaking it. The plague, the relentless hunter, has found its way into your home, singling out one of your own. The fragile bubble of your family's perceived immunity has burst. Love in the shadow of death, a family's desperate fight. What follows is a blur of fear, desperate activity, and fervent, almost frantic, prayer. Your mother, her face a mask of anguish but her hands surprisingly steady, becomes a tireless sentinel. Day and night, she's by his side, bathing his fevered brow with cool cloths, trying to coax tiny sips of water or weak ale between his parched lips. Her whispers are a constant litany, prayers to the Virgin, to the saints, to a God who feels terrifyingly distant. Every small act of care is an act of defiance against the encroaching darkness, a refusal to surrender her child without a fight. Your father, a man usually strong and capable, paces the small cottage, his heart heavy with a helplessness that is almost unbearable for him. He talks wildly of taking your brother to the nearby monastery, where the monks are reputed to have some healing knowledge. But it's a desperate, futile thought. Everyone knows the monasteries are overwhelmed, themselves ravaged by the plague, with many of the brothers already dead or dying. There is no sanctuary to be found there. You and your other siblings hover in the background, caught between the instinct to help and the chilling fear of contagion. The air in the single room is thick with the scent of sickness, with your brother's labored breathing, with unspoken anxieties. You take turns sitting with him, though a primal fear makes you want to keep your distance. You might wipe his face, or simply hold his hand, a small, inadequate gesture against the enormity of his suffering. The abyss, 3 days hovering at death's door. For 3 agonizing days, your brother's condition spirals downwards. The bubo on his neck swells to the size of a hen's egg, then larger, its color shifting from an angry red to a bruised, ominous purple, and finally, to a terrifying black. His breathing becomes a ragged, painful struggle for every gasp of air. He cries out in delirium, his small body racked with pain he can no longer comprehend, his words a jumble of disconnected phrases and tormented moans. He thrashes weakly, lost in a world of fever dreams and unbearable suffering. Your family watches, their hearts breaking, as hope dwindles with each passing hour. You've seen this before, in other cottages, with other families. You know the grim trajectory. This is the stage where the light in the eyes dims, where the struggle ceases, where the anointing with holy oils, if a priest can even be found and is willing to come, becomes the final act. The weight of anticipated grief is suffocating, a heavy shroud settling over your home. Against all odds, the turn of the tide. And then, on the fourth day, when despair is at its deepest, when you're all braced for the final, inevitable blow, something utterly unexpected happens. It's not a dramatic, instantaneous healing, but a subtle shift, a flicker of change. While most plague victims worsen and die at this stage, your brother's raging fever begins to break. The unholy heat that has consumed him starts to recede. He is weak, terribly, frighteningly weak, like a newborn kitten, but for the first time in days, his eyes open, and there's a glimmer of alertness, of recognition. The monstrous bubo remains, but it seems different. It's no longer as hard and angry. Over the next few days, it softens, and then, in a development that is both disgusting and profoundly, unbelievably hopeful, it ruptures. A thick, foul-smelling pus drains from the wound. It's a grotesque sign, but in the grim lexicon of the plague, it's a signal that the body might be winning its desperate battle, expelling the poison. Against all odds, against every expectation, your brother is one of the infinitesimally few who will survive the Black Death. The relief that floods your home is so immense it's almost a physical force, bringing your parents to their knees in grateful, sobbing prayer. It feels like the resurrection, a literal pulling back from the grave. The unseen shield, a secret woven into life itself, the hidden truth. But why? Why him? In your medieval world, the only answers are divine. It is God's will, a miracle, a sign of special favor. Your family celebrates his recovery as exactly that. What you cannot possibly know, what no one in the 14th century could even conceive, is that the answer might lie hidden deep within his very blood, his genetic makeup. Centuries from now, scientists will discover that certain individuals carry a rare genetic mutation, known as CCR5 delta 32. This mutation affects a protein on the surface of white blood cells, a protein that Yersinia pestis, the plague bacterium, uses as a doorway to infect those cells. The delta 32 mutation, in essence, changes the lock on that door, making it much harder for the bacteria to get in and wreak havoc. Your brother, and perhaps others in your family, may well carry this genetic quirk, this random, lucky accident of nature. It's a biological lottery, and he, against astronomical odds, has drawn a winning ticket. Even more astonishingly, this same genetic trait, forged in the crucible of the Black Death and passed down through generations of survivors, will centuries later be found to offer significant protection against another deadly scourge, HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. The Black Death, in its brutal act of natural selection, inadvertently helped to arm some of humanity's descendants against a disease that wouldn't even exist for another 600 years. But that, of course, is a story for a future you cannot imagine. Whispers of immunity, the few who defied the scythe. As your brother slowly, painstakingly regains his strength, you observe your village with new eyes. You notice others who, like him, seem to walk through the firestorm of plague unscathed, despite constant exposure. There's the village gravedigger, an unsavory character who, some whisper, robs the dead before burying them. He handles plague-riddled corpses daily, yet never shows a single symptom. There's the midwife, who tends to the sick and dying when she isn't delivering babies, her hands constantly in contact with the contagion, yet she too remains healthy. Medieval minds will attribute their survival to divine intervention, inscrutable luck, or perhaps, in the case of the gravedigger, some suspicious dealings with dark forces. The idea of a hidden, biological shield is beyond their ken. The scars of survival, living with the ghost of death. Your brother's recovery is not swift or easy. He is left profoundly weakened, a shadow of his former self. The drained bubo on his neck eventually heals, but it leaves an ugly, puckered scar that will mark him for life, a permanent, visible reminder of his harrowing brush with death. But a scar, however disfiguring, is infinitely preferable to a grave. Your family treats each day of his returning strength as the precious gift it is. Yet, survival comes with its own burdens. One evening, his voice still raspy from his illness, He asks the question that haunts so many who live when others perish: why did I live when so many died? Your mother, her faith a simple, unwavering rock, might answer, it was God's will, my son. But you, and perhaps your brother too, feel a strange unease, a sense of survivor's guilt, a profound and unsettling awareness of the sheer arbitrariness of it all. The joy of his survival is forever tinged by the memory of the countless others who were not so fortunate, those who lacked that unseen, unknown genetic advantage. A changed world, a changed life. Even as your family rejoices in this personal miracle, the plague continues its deadly work outside your cottage door. The village is a ghost of its former self, its population decimated, its fields untended. The experience of the plague, the intimate dance with death, and this inexplicable survival, will forever alter your family. You have looked into the abyss and, by some incredible twist of fate or biology, have been allowed to step back. Life, you now understand with a terrifying clarity, is a fragile, precious, and often cruelly random gift. A world empty. Step back into your village, the one where your brother miraculously survived. It's a different place now. The first thing that strikes you is the silence. Not a peaceful quiet, but an unnerving emptiness. Where once there were perhaps 200 souls, now you might count fewer than 90. Walk down the familiar pathways, and you'll see cottage after cottage standing vacant, their small windows like hollow, staring eyes. Doors hang ajar, creaking in the wind. Gardens, once meticulously tended and bursting with life, are now choked with weeds, a wild tangle reclaiming what was once cultivated. The rhythmic sounds of daily work that formed the backdrop of your life, the blacksmith's hammer ringing on the anvil, the weaver's shuttle clacking in the loom, the miller's wheel groaning as it turned, are muted, infrequent, or in some cases, gone altogether. Many of the hands that performed those tasks are now dust. Fields that once stretched green and gold to the horizon now lie fallow, untended. The rich earth, usually turned and sown with such care, is slowly being reclaimed by wild grasses and scrub. It's not just the physical landscape that's scarred, it's the human one. Every empty chair at a neighbor's table, every missing face in the Sunday congregation, every child who no longer plays in the village square is a fresh stab of grief, a constant reminder of the abyss the community has just crawled out of. There's a haunting quality to the air, a sense of profound loss that clings to everything. 2. The unforeseen windfall, land and food for the few. Yet, amidst this desolation, a strange and unexpected paradox emerges for those who survived. With so many mouths gone, the existing stores of grain and salted meat suddenly last much longer. For the first time in living memory for many, the gnawing fear of immediate starvation recedes a little. More strikingly, land, the most precious commodity in your overcrowded pre-plague world, is suddenly abundant. There's far more arable land available than there are people left to farm it. This leads to a quiet revolution in agriculture. Survivors abandon the marginal, less fertile plots that had been painstakingly cultivated out of sheer necessity before the plague. Now, they can concentrate their efforts on the richest, most productive soils. The result? Crop yields per person, per acre worked, dramatically improve. Food, for those still alive to eat it, becomes more plentiful than it has been for generations. This new abundance also brings about a shift in diet. With more land available and fewer people to feed from traditional crops, some fields are converted to pasture for raising animals. Meat, cheese, and butter, once rare luxuries reserved for feast days or the tables of the wealthy, begin to appear more frequently in the humble cottages of peasant survivors. It's a bitter kind of bounty, reaped from the graves of millions, but it undeniably improves the material well-being and even the physical health of those left behind. 3. The power vacuum, labor becomes king. But the most profound transformation, the one that will send shockwaves through the very foundations of medieval society, stems from a simple, brutal equation. The catastrophic loss of life has created an acute, desperate shortage of labor. Suddenly, the common peasant, the humble artisan, the very people who were once considered expendable, easily replaceable cogs in the feudal machine, find themselves holding an astonishing new power. Think about your father, the skilled carpenter. Before the plague, he like other craftsmen, worked long hours for modest pay, often at the beck and call of the local lord. His service is commanded rather than requested. Now, with perhaps half the carpenters in the region dead, his skills are in fierce demand. The lord of the manor, who once would have simply ordered your father to undertake repairs, now finds himself in the unfamiliar position of negotiating. "He offered me a silver penny for just 3 days' work," your father might tell your mother, his voice a mixture of disbelief and dawning awareness of his new worth. "And a side of bacon, too." Such wages were unthinkable before this infernal sickness. This story is repeated across every trade and every level of society. Farm laborers, once a dime a dozen, now find they can demand significantly higher wages for their work. If one lord won't pay, another, desperate to get his fields plowed or his harvest brought in, surely will. Household servants, especially those with experience running a large estate, are sought after by noble families whose own staff have been decimated. And what of the serfs, those peasants legally bound to the land, obligated to work for their lord for little more than the right to cultivate a small patch of earth for their own survival? The plague shatters their chains in a way no decree ever could. Many lords, facing ruined estates and unharvested fields, are forced to offer unprecedented incentives to keep their remaining serfs from leaving: reduced labor services, lower rents, even outright freedom. Other serfs simply realize that the old rules no longer apply. With so many dead, and the administrative machinery of the manors in chaos, who is there to stop them if they simply walk away? They move to other manors offering better terms, or they drift towards the towns and cities, seeking new opportunities. The traditional bonds of feudalism, which had tied the peasantry to the land for centuries, are unraveling at an astonishing pace. 4. A new chapter for women, stepping into the void. The plague's demographic devastation also, unexpectedly, cracks open doors for women. In a society where men held most of the economic and legal power, the deaths of so many husbands, fathers, and sons create vacuums that women, out of necessity and often with remarkable resilience, step in to fill. Widows, who in pre-plague times might have been expected to quickly remarry or become dependent on male relatives, now find themselves managing farms, shops, and artisan workshops left behind by their deceased husbands. They learn new trades, negotiate contracts, and command workers. Guilds, traditionally male-dominated and highly restrictive, are often forced by the sheer lack of skilled men to informally relax their rules and allow women, usually the widows or daughters of master craftsmen, to continue businesses and even take on apprentices. A woman in a neighboring village, for instance, might scandalize traditionalists by taking over her husband's blacksmith forge, shoeing horses and mending plows, but her essential service is too valuable to be denied. While many of these gains will prove temporary, contracting as populations eventually recover, this period marks a significant, if often overlooked, expansion of women's economic roles and agency. The old guard trembles, elites scramble to maintain control. This dramatic shift in the balance of power sends tremors of alarm, even panic, through the ranks of the nobility, the wealthy landowners, and the established merchant classes. They watch in disbelief and outrage as the traditional social order, the one that had guaranteed their privilege and authority for centuries, seems to be crumbling before their eyes. They complain bitterly about the arrogance and insolence of the lower classes, who are no longer content with their divinely ordained station in life, who dare to demand higher wages, better food, finer clothing, and more freedom. Desperate to turn back the tide and restore the old certainties, authorities across Europe enact repressive legislation. In England, the government issues the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, followed by the more comprehensive Statute of Labourers in 1351. These laws aim to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, to compel able-bodied men and women to work for anyone who requires their labour at these fixed rates, to forbid workers from leaving their parish in search of better pay, and even to control the prices of food and other essential goods. Similar laws pop up in France, Spain, and various Italian city-states. But these efforts are, for the most part, doomed to spectacular failure. The economic laws of supply and demand, supercharged by the massive labor shortage, prove far more powerful than any royal decree or parliamentary statute. Enforcement is a nightmare, especially in rural areas where local officials are often sympathetic to the workers or simply lack the means to compel obedience. Workers, keenly aware of their newfound leverage, find ingenious ways to circumvent the wage controls, demanding payment in kind, food, clothing, lodging, on top of the legal wage, or simply refusing to work, or working poorly, until better terms are offered. The old order is fighting a losing battle against a new economic reality. The cry for freedom, when patience runs out. This newfound economic clout, combined with a growing awareness of their own indispensability, fuels a new spirit of assertiveness, even defiance, among the common people. The old deference begins to fray. Decades of simmering resentment over feudal obligations, heavy taxation, and social injustice, now coupled with rising expectations, create a volatile brew that, in several places, explodes into open revolt. In France, in 1358, the countryside around Paris erupts in the Jacquerie, a brutal and desperate uprising of peasants who, pushed beyond endurance, turn their fury on the castles and persons of the nobility. Though savagely suppressed, it's a terrifying signal to the ruling classes that the peasantry is no longer a passive, silent majority. A more organized and ideologically charged rebellion breaks out in England in 1381, the Peasants' Revolt. Led by figures like Wat Tyler and Jack Straw, and inspired by the radical preaching of a Lollard priest named John Ball, tens of thousands of commoners march on London. Their demands are revolutionary for the time: an end to serfdom, the abolition of the hated poll tax, the reform of the church, and a greater measure of social equality. John Ball's famous sermon, with its incendiary question, "When Adam delved, dug, and Eve spun, who was then the gentleman?" strikes at the very heart of the aristocratic claim to inherent superiority and divine right. It's a radical call for a return to a mythical state of natural equality. Like the Jacquerie, the English peasants' revolt is eventually crushed through a combination of treachery and brutal military force. Its leaders are executed, its followers scattered. 7. The unraveling of an age, the dawn of a new era. Despite the violent suppression of these uprisings, something fundamental has shifted. The old certainties are gone. The feudal system, particularly in Western Europe, has been dealt a blow from which it will never fully recover. While it won't vanish overnight, its foundations have been irrevocably weakened. The Black Death, in its horrific passage, has unintentionally acted as a grim but powerful agent of social and economic change. It has thinned populations, certainly, but in doing so, it has also empowered the survivors, accelerated the transition from a labor-based economy to one where wages and mobility play a far greater role, and sown the seeds of a new consciousness among common people, a dawning awareness of their own worth, their collective strength, and their right to demand a fairer share of the fruits of their labor. The world, your world, will never be quite the same again. The plague returns. It's a world that has changed in many ways since 1347, but some fears are timeless. And the fear of the plague is one of them. Right now, in the summer of 1665, London is in the grip of what will become known as the Great Plague, a devastating outbreak that will ultimately claim the lives of an estimated 100,000 Londoners, nearly a quarter of the city's population. The capital is a place of terror, of shuttered houses marked with red crosses, of death carts rumbling through deserted streets. But far from the smoky chaos of London, nestled in the picturesque Peak District, lies the village of Bean, pronounced Team. It is a peaceful, close-knit community of about 800 souls, mostly lead miners, farmers, and their families. Life here follows the familiar, comforting rhythms of rural England: work in the mines or fields, Sunday services at the parish church of St. Lawrence, evenings spent with family or sharing news at the local tavern. Everyone knows everyone else, families have lived here for generations. The plague, they tell themselves, is a city problem, a horror unlikely to reach their remote, idyllic corner of the world. They couldn't be more wrong. 2. The fatal arrival, a parcel of death. Fate, as it so often does, arrives in the most ordinary of packages. In late August or early September of 1665, a bundle of cloth arrives in Eam from plague-stricken London, addressed to the local tailor, Alexander Hadfield. Perhaps it contains patterns for the latest fashions, or fabrics he couldn't source locally. Hadfield's assistant, a man named George Vickers, who lodges with the tailor's family, has the unfortunate task of unpacking the parcel. The cloth, by some accounts, feels damp after its long journey. Thinking to dry it out, Vickers hangs it by the fire. In doing so, he unwittingly unleashes a deadly, invisible cargo hidden within its folds, fleas, carrying the plague bacterium. Within days, George Vickers falls violently ill. He develops a raging fever, and then the telltale, agonizingly painful buboes, those swollen lymph nodes in the neck, armpits, or groin, begin to appear. The village watches in horror as this strong young man rapidly deteriorates. By September 7, 1665, George Vickers is dead. He is Eam's first plague victim. Panic, swift and sharp, ripples through the small community. Soon, others who live near Vickers or handled the cloth also sicken and die. By the end of September, several more villagers have perished. The plague, having breached Eam's defenses, has gained its first horrifying foothold. As autumn progresses, the situation worsens. More families are struck down, the death rate climbs, and the familiar, dreadful specter of the Black Death casts its long shadow over the once peaceful village. The natural human reaction in such circumstances is flight. In London, anyone who could afford it, including King Charles II and his court, had fled the city for the presumed safety of country estates. Some of Eam's wealthier residents begin to make similar preparations, intending to seek refuge in uninfected areas until the danger passes. It seems the sensible, logical thing to do. 3. A courage born of conscience, the unthinkable decision. But it's at this critical juncture, as fear and the instinct for self-preservation threaten to scatter the community, that two men stepped forward with an extraordinary, almost unthinkable, proposition. One is William Mompesson, Eam's relatively new rector, a young man in his late 20s. The other is Thomas Stanley, the previous rector who had been ejected from his post for his Puritan beliefs but still commanded great respect in the village. Putting aside any past religious differences, these two leaders unite to present a radical plan to their terrified parishioners. They propose that the entire village of Eam voluntarily quarantine itself. No one will leave. No one will enter. The plague, they argue, must be contained within their village boundaries, preventing its spread to the surrounding towns and villages of North Derbyshire, which would otherwise be at grave risk. It is a staggering request, an appeal to a level of altruism and self-sacrifice that seems almost superhuman. They are, in essence, asking the villagers to accept that many more of them will die, to condemn themselves to months of suffering and loss, all to protect strangers in neighboring communities. And remarkably, incredibly, the people of Eam agree. Perhaps it's the power of Mompesson and Stanley's leadership, their moral authority. Perhaps it's a deep-seated sense of community responsibility. Perhaps it's a dawning, horrifying understanding of the plague's relentless contagiousness. Whatever the reasons, this small village makes a collective decision that will write its name into the annals of heroism. The village boundary becomes a cordon sanitaire, an invisible line between life and death that no resident of Eam will willingly cross. Arrangements are made for food and supplies to be left at designated boundary stones by outsiders, most notably by the Earl of Devonshire from nearby Chatsworth House, who pledges to provide for the isolated community. Money to pay for these provisions is left in vinegar-filled holes in the rocks, as it's widely believed that vinegar will disinfect the coins. 4. Love, loss, and unimaginable strength, stories from within the cordon. What follows is one of the most poignant and heroic, yet devastatingly tragic, episodes in the long history of humanity's battle with infectious disease. Summer turns to autumn, autumn to the bleakness of winter, and winter eventually gives way to a spring that brings no relief, only a resurgence of the pestilence. Through it all, the plague continues its deadly work within the confines of Eam. Entire families are wiped out. Children are orphaned, only to die themselves days later. Houses stand empty, their occupants buried hastily in gardens, fields, or any available patch of ground, as the churchyard quickly becomes full. Yet, Within this crucible of suffering, individual stories emerge that illuminate the extraordinary capacity of the human spirit for courage, endurance, and love. One of the most heartbreaking and awe-inspiring is the story of Elizabeth Hancock. A farmer's wife living at Riley Farm, a little outside the main village but still within the cordon, she endures a loss almost beyond comprehension. In the space of just 8 days in August 1666, at the height of the outbreak, the plague claims her husband and all 6 of her children. With no one to help her, neighbors terrified of approaching the infected household, Elizabeth, with unimaginable fortitude, single-handedly drags each body, one by one, up a steep hillside near their home and buries them herself. The Riley graves, as they come to be known, still stand today, a stark and moving testament to one woman's unimaginable suffering and strength. And the most remarkable aspect of Elizabeth's story? Despite this intimate, prolonged contact with the plague-riddled bodies of her entire family, she herself never contracts the disease. Like the survivors we met in the 14th century, it's highly probable that Elizabeth Hancock carried the CCR5 Delta 32 genetic mutation, her unseen, unknown shield against the pestilence. Then there's the curious case of Marshall Howe. As the official gravedigger either dies or becomes overwhelmed, Howe, a man of somewhat dubious character, takes on the grim task. His motives are not entirely noble. It's said he takes the opportunity to loot the homes of the dead before disposing of their bodies. Yet, his story contains its own medical mystery. He handles dozens, perhaps hundreds, of infected corpses. He enters plague-ridden houses that others avoid at all costs. By all logic, he should be among the first to die. Yet, Marshall Howe survives the entire outbreak without ever showing any symptoms. Again, modern science points to the likely explanation, the same protective genetic mutation that likely spared Elizabeth Hancock. What Howe might have attributed to luck, or a strong constitution, or even divine, or diabolical, protection, is almost certainly the result of a tiny alteration in his DNA. The quarantine also brings stories of heartbreaking romance. Emmett Seidel, a young woman from Eam, is betrothed to Roland Torrey, who lives in the neighboring, uninfected village. The cordon sanitaire brutally separates them. Unwilling to completely lose contact, they arrange to meet at a safe distance across Cucklet Dell, a natural ravine that forms part of the village boundary. There, standing far apart to avoid any risk of transmitting infection, they can at least see each other, exchange words of love and comfort, and dream of a future that seems increasingly unlikely. These brief, distant meetings sustain them through the early months. But as spring turns into the deadly summer of 1666, and the plague reaches its terrible peak in Eam, Emmett stops coming to their meeting place. Roland continues to appear, day after day, calling her name, his voice echoing unanswered through the dell. Only after the quarantine finally ends does he learn the devastating truth. Emmett had died in April, one of the many young lives extinguished by the plague. Their love story, cut short by disease but marked by unwavering devotion, remains one of Eam's most enduring and tragic legends. There are even stranger tales, like that of Margaret Blackwell. She falls gravely ill with plague symptoms and is left for dead by her brother. In her fevered, delirious state, Margaret staggers to the kitchen, desperately thirsty. Mistaking a container of bacon fat for milk or water, she drinks deeply of the greasy liquid. To everyone's astonishment, including her own, Margaret recovers. For centuries, villagers would tell the story of how bacon fat cured the plague, a folk remedy born of desperation and coincidence. The truth, of course, is likely more complex. Margaret probably also carried the genetic resistance, and her recovery was coincidental to her unusual beverage choice. But the legend persists, a reminder of how desperately people searched for any glimmer of hope, any potential cure, in the face of the plague's relentless onslaught. Throughout this ordeal, Eam's religious leaders provide what comfort and guidance they can. William Mompesson, who championed the quarantine, pays a terrible personal price for his courageous stand. His beloved wife, Catherine, contracts the plague while helping to care for sick villagers and dies in his arms in August 1666, at the very height of the outbreak. Mompesson, though devastated by grief, continues to minister to his suffering congregation until the very end. Church services are moved outdoors to Cucklet Dell, where the fresh air is believed to reduce the risk of contagion, with villagers standing far apart from one another, an early, intuitive form of what we now call social distancing. The price of heroism, counting the cost. By the time the plague finally runs its course in Nîmes, in November 1666, it has raged through the isolated village for 14 agonizing months. The cost is staggering. Of the approximately 800 villagers present when George Vickers first unpacked that fateful bundle of cloth, only about 340 remain alive. More than half the population has perished. Entire family lines are extinguished. The village's social fabric is torn apart, leaving gaps that will take generations to mend. A sacrifice not in vain, the legacy of Yme. Yet, their unimaginable sacrifice achieves its purpose. The plague is contained within Yme's boundaries. The surrounding communities, the towns and villages of North Derbyshire that would almost certainly have been infected had Yme's residents fled, are largely spared the devastation. Thousands of lives, it is estimated, are saved by the deliberate, courageous choice of a few hundred ordinary people to face death rather than spread it. In the quiet, grief-stricken aftermath, as the survivors begin the long, painful process of rebuilding their shattered community, they cannot know the full extent of the legacy they have created. They cannot imagine that, more than 3.5 centuries later, their story will still be told and retold, studied by historians, celebrated by poets, and held up as an extraordinary example of communal courage and self-sacrifice. They cannot know that the plague that devastated their village was, in fact, the last major outbreak of bubonic plague in England, or that scientists of the future would take a keen interest in their descendants, discovering unusually high rates of the CCR5 Delta 32 mutation among people whose family lines trace back to Yme survivors, some of the strongest evidence of how infectious disease shapes human evolution through natural selection. 7. Echoes for today. The enduring meaning of Yme. All the Yme villagers knew was that they had endured an ordeal almost beyond comprehension. They had watched their neighbors, friends, and family members die by the dozens. They had maintained their self-imposed isolation through summer heat and winter cold, through fear and grief and unimaginable loss. And now, as the plague finally released its grip, they had to find a way to go on living. The story of Yme is not just a historical curiosity, it remains a living testament to the best of the human spirit. It reminds us, especially in times of global crisis, that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary selflessness, and that collective action, even at great personal cost, can indeed save lives and change the course of history. A new European landscape. Imagine Europe in the decades following those initial, devastating waves of pestilence. It's a continent haunted by ghosts, its population slashed by anywhere from a third to a half. This wasn't just a demographic dip. It was a cataclysm that tore through the very fabric of medieval life. The old certainties, the rigid hierarchies, the unquestioned traditions, many of them lay shattered alongside the millions dead. In the face of such overwhelming, indiscriminate death, people were forced to reevaluate everything: their relationship with God, their rulers, their communities, and even the value of their own lives and labor. The old ways hadn't just been challenged. In many cases, they had proven catastrophically inadequate, or had simply broken down under the strain. This was a world ripe for, and in desperate need of, profound change. 2. Shaking the foundations, faith under duress. Perhaps nowhere was the questioning more acute than in matters of faith. The medieval church was the bedrock of society, its doctrines and authority permeating every aspect of life, from birth to death and beyond. It offered explanations for the inexplicable, solace in times of suffering, and the promise of eternal salvation. But the Black Death posed a terrible challenge to this spiritual edifice. Why, people asked, did their fervent prayers, their solemn processions, their acts of penance, seem to go utterly unanswered as the plague scythed through their communities? Why did God's wrath, if that's what it was, fall so mercilessly on the innocent as well as the supposedly sinful? Why did so many priests, monks, and nuns, the very people dedicated to God's service, die in such appalling numbers, often while heroically tending to the sick? And why did other clergy, in stark contrast, abandoned their flocks in their hour of greatest need, fleeing for their own safety. These weren't just abstract theological debates, they were anguished questions torn from the hearts of a traumatized populace. The Church's inability to provide either effective protection or convincing explanations for the catastrophe led to a significant erosion of its once unquestioned authority for many. While some survivors clung even more desperately to traditional piety, seeing their survival as a mark of divine favor, others developed a more skeptical, questioning attitude. A more personal, introspective form of faith began to emerge for some, less reliant on the formal institution of the Church and its intermediaries. This undercurrent of disillusionment and the new willingness to challenge religious authority didn't directly cause the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, but it undoubtedly helped to till the soil, creating an environment where Martin Luther's radical ideas would find a receptive audience a century and a half later. The monolithic religious unity of medieval Christendom had been irrevocably cracked. 3. The mirror of mortality, art, literature, and the human condition. The sheer scale of death, its suddenness and horror, left an indelible mark on the European psyche, and this trauma found vivid expression in the art and literature of the period. A morbid fascination with death became a prominent theme. The most iconic artistic motif to emerge was the danse macabre, or dance of death. Depicted in murals, woodcuts, and illuminated manuscripts, the danse macabre typically showed personified death, often as a grinning skeleton, leading a procession of figures from all walks of life: popes, emperors, kings, knights, merchants, peasants, monks, beautiful ladies, innocent children, all inexorably dancing towards a common grave. The message was stark and democratic: death is the great equalizer, it comes for everyone, regardless of status, wealth, or piety. It was a powerful social commentary and a grim reminder of life's fragility. Alongside this focus on mortality, there was also a subtle but significant shift in artistic and intellectual focus. While religious themes remained dominant, a greater emphasis began to be placed on the human experience, on human suffering, human emotion, and the realities of earthly life. This burgeoning humanism, a philosophical and ethical stance that emphasizes the potential and agency of human beings, valuing human reason and experience over blind faith or established dogma, was a crucial intellectual current that would eventually blossom into the Renaissance. The plague, by forcing people to confront the stark realities of human existence and the limitations of old explanations, inadvertently helped to nudge European thought from a predominantly God-centered worldview towards one that gave more prominence to humanity itself. 4. Necessity, the mother of invention. Technological leaps. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it created an unprecedented labor crisis. With up to half the workforce gone in many areas, the old ways of doing things, heavily reliant on abundant and cheap human muscle, were no longer viable. This acute labor shortage became a powerful driver of technological innovation and the adoption of labor-saving devices. Techniques that could multiply the efficiency of the remaining workers were suddenly not just desirable, but essential for economic survival. Watermills, long used for grinding grain, were increasingly adapted for a wider range of industrial purposes, powering bellows for blast furnaces and iron production, driving hammers for metalworking, fulling cloth, a process of cleaning and thickening woolen fabric, and even operating sawmills. Windmills, too, saw wider application. Perhaps the most significant long-term technological development spurred by this environment was the eventual invention of printing with movable type by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century. Before the plague, books were painstakingly copied by hand by scribes, a slow and expensive process. The post-plague world, with its shortage of skilled scribes who could now command premium wages, created immense economic pressure to find a cheaper, faster way to reproduce written material. While Gutenberg's invention came nearly a century after the first plague wave, the socio-economic conditions created by the pandemic, including a growing literate merchant class with a demand for books and a scarcity of traditional scribal labor, were crucial contributing factors. The printing press would, in turn, revolutionize the spread of knowledge, fuel the Reformation, and become a cornerstone of the modern world. The language of experience, new words, new realities. The profound experience of the plague also wove itself into the very language people spoke, leaving linguistic fossils that we can still find today. The word quarantine, for example, derives from the Italian quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days. This referred to the period that ships arriving in Venetian ports from plague-stricken areas were required to remain isolated offshore before their passengers and crew were allowed to land, a direct public health measure born of bitter experience with the plague's contagiousness. Even seemingly innocent childhood rhymes may carry dark echoes of the plague. The popular, though debated by some folklorists, interpretation of Ring Around the Rosy links its verses to plague symptoms, Ring Around the Rosy referring to the rosy red, ring-shaped rash that sometimes appeared, a pocket full of posies alluding to the herbs and flowers people carried to ward off miasma, and ashes, ashes, we all fall down grimly symbolizing cremation or the suddenness of death. Whether accurate or not, its persistence suggests how deeply the imagery of epidemic disease can embed itself in cultural memory. Learning from disaster, the dawn of public health. Before the Black Death, concepts of contagion and public health as we understand them were virtually non-existent. Illness was generally attributed to divine will, astrological influences, or imbalances in the body's humors. But the plague's relentless, observable pattern of spread, moving along trade routes, leaping from person to person in close contact, devastating entire households, made it impossible to ignore the contagious nature of at least some diseases. Out of sheer desperation and empirical observation, communities began to develop practical, if rudimentary, public health responses. These weren't based on germ theory, which wouldn't emerge for another 5 centuries, but on a pragmatic understanding that certain actions seemed to slow the spread. As mentioned, the practice of quarantine was instituted for ships and travelers from infected areas. Infected households were often isolated, sometimes forcibly, their doors marked to warn others away. The belongings of plague victims were frequently burned, based on the idea that they might carry the seeds of the disease. In some Italian city-states, and later elsewhere, authorities began to appoint health boards or magistrates with extraordinary powers during epidemics. These bodies could enforce quarantines, arrange for the burial of the dead, oversee sanitation, and restrict public gatherings, the very earliest forms of organized public health intervention. These pragmatic, experience-driven approaches, refined over subsequent plague outbreaks, saved countless lives in later centuries and laid the foundational principles for modern epidemic management. 7. A fork in the road, diverging paths for East and West. It's worth noting briefly that while the Black Death acted as a catalyst for the decline of serfdom and the rise of peasant freedoms in much of Western Europe, the outcome was starkly different in Eastern Europe. There, the nobility, facing similar labor shortages, often succeeded in tightening their grip on the peasantry, leading to what historians call the Second Serfdom. This system of intensified labor obligations and restricted mobility would persist in many parts of Eastern Europe well into the 19th century, creating a significant socio-economic divergence between the two halves of the continent with long-lasting historical consequences. 8. The end of an unquestioning world. Embracing change. Perhaps the most profound and enduring legacy of the Black Death was the way it shattered the medieval mindset, particularly the deeply ingrained acceptance of an unchanging, divinely ordained social and natural order. When up to half the known world could perish in a few short years, when the most sacred institutions proved powerless, when the very structure of society could be turned upside down by an invisible force, the idea that things must always remain as they have always been lost much of its power. The plague demonstrated, in the most brutal way imaginable, that catastrophic change was possible. It forced survivors to adapt, to innovate, to question, and to reconsider everything they thought they knew. This new, hard-won openness to change, this realization that the world was not static but mutable, was a critical psychological shift. It helped to create the intellectual and cultural environment from which the Renaissance, with its explosion of artistic and scientific creativity, the Reformation, with its challenge to religious hegemony, and ultimately, the complex, dynamic, and often turbulent emergence of the modern world, would spring. The Black Death was a crucible, and the Europe that emerged from it, scarred and traumatized though it was also a Europe on the cusp of reinvention. How the past lives in our genes. When a cataclysm of the Black Death's magnitude sweeps through a population, killing a third, a half, or even more, it's not just a historical tragedy, it's a massive evolutionary event. Think of it as nature conducting a brutal, high-stakes experiment. Those who survive are not always just the lucky ones. In many cases, they are the ones whose bodies, for reasons invisible to them and their contemporaries, possess some inherent advantage, some quirk in their genetic makeup that gives them a fighting chance against the invading pathogen. And when these survivors have children, they pass those advantageous traits down, subtly reshaping the genetic landscape of future generations. The Black Death was one of the most intense selective pressures humanity has ever faced, and its echoes are literally written into our DNA. 2. The lucky mutation, unraveling the mystery of CCR5 Delta 32. Remember your brother, who miraculously survived the plague when so many others perished. Or Elizabeth Hancock Anim, who buried her entire family yet never fell ill herself. Or Marshall Howe, the Ian gravedigger, who waded through death daily yet remained untouched. For centuries, their survival, and that of countless others like them, would have been attributed to divine will, extraordinary luck, or perhaps even darker, more superstitious explanations. But fast forward to the age of modern genetics, and scientists begin to unravel a fascinating biological secret. In the late 20th century, researchers identified a specific genetic mutation known as CCR5 Delta 32, or CCR5 Delta 32. Here's the simplified science. On the surface of some of our immune cells, specifically white blood cells like T cells and macrophages, is a protein called CCR5. Think of this protein as a kind of docking station or doorway that certain viruses and bacteria use to gain entry into the cell. The Delta 32 mutation is a small deletion in the gene that codes for the CCR5 protein. This deletion results in a smaller, non-functional version of the protein being produced, or sometimes no protein at all on the cell surface. Now, how does this relate to the Black Death? It turns out that Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague, also appears to utilize the CCR5 protein, or a pathway affected by it, to effectively invade and manipulate host immune cells. So, individuals who inherited one copy of the CCR5 Delta 32 mutation from a parent would produce fewer functional CCR5 doorways, giving them a degree of partial protection against the plague. Those incredibly fortunate individuals who inherited two copies of the mutation, one from each parent, would have very few, if any, functional CCR5 receptors on their immune cells, making it extremely difficult for the plague bacteria to establish a successful infection. They had, in essence, a built-in biological shield. It was a genetic lottery, and those carrying the Delta 32 mutation held a winning ticket in the deadliest game of chance humanity had ever played. This mutation, a random blip in the genetic code, suddenly became a lifesaver. 3. An unexpected echo. From medieval plague to modern HIV/AIDS. The story of CCR5 Delta 32 takes an even more astonishing turn with the emergence of a new pandemic in the late 20th century, HIV/AIDS. As medical researchers raced to understand this devastating new virus, they made a startling observation. Some individuals, despite repeated high-risk exposures to HIV, seemed naturally resistant to infection. Others, if infected, progressed to AIDS much more slowly than average. Scientists hunted for the reason, and what they found sent ripples through the medical world and back through history. Many of these HIV-resistant individuals were found to carry that same CCR5 Delta 32 mutation. The connection became clear. HIV, much like the plague bacterium, though through different specific mechanisms, also uses the CCR5 protein as a primary coreceptor, a crucial keyhole, to enter and infect human immune cells, particularly CD4 plus T cells. For people with two copies of the CCR5 Delta 32 mutation, their cells lack this functional keyhole, effectively barring HIV from entry. Those with one copy had fewer keyholes, leading to a slower progression of the disease if they did get infected. Think about the profound implications of this. A genetic adaptation, likely selected for and amplified in European populations by the horrific selective pressure of the Black Death, and possibly other earlier plagues or diseases like smallpox, centuries later provided an unexpected, built-in defense against an entirely different type of pathogen, a virus that wouldn't even exist in its pandemic form for another 600 years. The medieval plague survivors, in passing on this genetic work, were inadvertently helping to protect some of their distant descendants from a future scourge they could never have imagined. This discovery wasn't just an academic curiosity, it had immediate, life-saving applications. Understanding the role of CCR5 in HIV infection led directly to the development of a new class of antiretroviral drugs called CCR5 antagonists, or entry inhibitors. These drugs work by blocking the CCR5 receptor on immune cells, essentially mimicking what the Delta 32 mutation does naturally, thereby preventing HIV from entering and infecting the cells. It's a stunning example of how studying the echoes of the medieval catastrophe can lead to cutting-edge medical breakthroughs in the modern age. People living with HIV today are benefiting from a biological lesson learned, at an almost unimaginable cost, by their ancestors centuries ago. 4. The double-edged sword, an immune system forged in fire. But the biological legacy of the Black Death likely extends beyond this single, remarkable mutation. Surviving such an overwhelming onslaught of disease would have broadly favored individuals whose immune systems were, in general, particularly robust, highly reactive, and quick to mount an aggressive defense. The plague acted as an intense filter, weeding out those with weaker or slower immune responses. Those who survived were, by definition, the immunologically fittest in that specific context. However, an immune system that is exceptionally aggressive and highly tuned can sometimes be a double-edged sword. Some scientists theorize that this intense selective pressure for hypervigilant immune responses during the Black Death and other historical epidemics might have inadvertently predisposed descendants of European survivors to a higher prevalence of certain autoimmune diseases. Conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, Crohn's disease, type 1 diabetes, and lupus, where the immune system mistakenly attacks the body's own healthy tissues, are notably more common in populations of European descent. The hypothesis is that an immune system primed by generations of fighting off deadly pathogens might be more prone to misfiring in an environment with a different microbial landscape or other triggers. The same heightened reactivity that was a lifesaver against Yersinia pestis could, in some individuals, turn inward, leading to chronic inflammatory and autoimmune conditions. It's a complex area of ongoing research, but it suggests that the fittest immune system in one historical context might carry different vulnerabilities in another. The biological echoes of the past are rarely simple. The pandemics as shapers of humanity, the long evolutionary view. What the story of CCR5 Delta 32 and the broader immunological questions illustrate so powerfully is that pandemics are not just fleeting historical tragedies that kill millions and then vanish without a trace. They are potent engines of human evolution. They reshape the genetic landscape of surviving populations, sometimes in dramatic ways, leaving behind legacies that can persist for centuries, even millennia, after the immediate crisis has passed. The Black Death stands as one of the most stark, brutal, and well-documented examples of this process in human history. It fundamentally altered the frequency of certain genes within European populations, favoring those that conferred even a slight survival advantage. It's a grim reminder that we are, in part, the biological product of our ancestors' struggles for survival against the invisible world of microbes. Our DNA carries a silent, molecular history of these ancient battles, a testament to the resilience and adaptability of our species, but also to the immense suffering that often drives evolutionary change. By the unseen inheritance, what the past teaches us. So, the next time you hear about the Black Death, remember that its story isn't confined to dusty history books or medieval chronicles. It's a story that, in a very real sense, continues to unfold within us. Our genetic makeup is a living archive, holding clues not only to who we are today but also to the immense challenges our ancestors faced and overcame. Understanding these deep biological legacies, these unseen inheritances, doesn't just satisfy historical curiosity, it provides crucial insights into human health, our susceptibility to certain diseases, our responses to new pathogens, and our outgoing, intricate dance with the microbial world that shares our planet. The shadows of past pandemics are long, and they continue to shape our present and inform our future in ways we are only just beginning to fully appreciate. Humanity's unbreakable will. If there's one thread that runs through the entire harrowing saga of the Black Death, and indeed through all great human catastrophes, it's this, an almost unbelievable capacity to endure. Imagine, if you can, a world where up to half the people you know, your family, your friends, your neighbors, vanish in a matter of months or years. Imagine the constant presence of death, the breakdown of order, the crushing weight of grief and fear. It's a scenario that, even from our distant vantage point, feels almost too horrific to contemplate. Yet, people did endure. They faced unimaginable loss, suffering that would break most modern sensibilities, and still, somehow, they found a way to keep going. Life, in its most fundamental, tenacious form, continued. Babies were born, though many would die young, fields were eventually, if sparsely, planted, and communities, however shattered, slowly began to pick up the pieces. This isn't to romanticize the suffering or to suggest it was anything less than an abyss of human misery. But it is to recognize that even in the face of near-apocalyptic devastation, the spark of human life, the instinct to survive and to seek a future, however bleak, proved incredibly difficult to extinguish. That simple, stubborn fact, that life continues, is perhaps the most profound lesson the Black Death offers. 2. Rebuilding from zero, the dawn after the darkest night. Think about what it must have been like for the survivors in a village like yours, once the initial fury of the plague had passed. The landscape, both physical and emotional, would have been one of utter desolation. Half your neighbors gone. Fields untended, reverting to wilderness. Workshops silent, their skilled artisans dead. Families shattered, children orphaned, the elderly left without support. The very fabric of the community, the intricate web of relationships, obligations, and traditions that held life together, would have been shredded. The psychological trauma alone is difficult for us to fully grasp, living with a constant memory of horror, the ghosts of the departed, and the gnawing uncertainty of whether the pestilence might return. Yet, rebuilding began. It wasn't grand or glorious, it was a slow, arduous, piecemeal process, driven by the most basic human needs. Someone had to clear a patch of overgrown land and plant the first seeds for the next meager harvest. Someone had to teach the orphaned children what little they knew. New, smaller family units formed from the remnants of the old. Markets, however depleted, eventually reopened, as survivors sought to trade what little they had. People like your father, the carpenter, found their skills in desperate demand, not just to repair the physical structures of the village, but in a way, to help rebuild the very framework of daily life. This wasn't a conscious, organized reconstruction effort in the modern sense. It was millions of individual acts of courage, resilience, and sheer determination. It was the choice, made day after day, to face the dawn, to do the necessary work, to care for those who remained, and to try, somehow, to carve out a future from the wreckage of the past. They carried an unbearable weight of memory, but they also, crucially, faced forward. 3. Adaptation as a survival mechanism. Learning the hard way. Humanity didn't just passively endure the plague and its recurrent outbreaks over the following centuries, it adapted. This adaptation was often slow, halting, and born of brutal trial and error, because the enemy remained invisible and misunderstood for so long. But with each successive wave of pestilence, communities and authorities, however imperfectly, learned something. We saw the rudimentary beginnings of public health measures, the concept of quarantine, isolating ships and travelers from infected areas, the marking and isolation of infected households, the sometimes drastic, and often futile, but telling, measures like burning the belongings of victims. Cities began to appoint health officials, to keep better records of mortality, to try and understand the patterns of the disease. These weren't scientific breakthroughs in our sense, but they were pragmatic responses, attempts to impose some control, some rational action, in the face of overwhelming chaos. Centuries later, the villagers of Eam demonstrated a particularly poignant and conscious form of adaptation and sacrifice. Their voluntary quarantine, based on the hard-won understanding that isolation could prevent spread, was a remarkable act of communal responsibility, saving countless lives beyond their own boundaries. It showed a level of understanding, however empirical, that had been tragically absent during the first onslaught of the 14th century. This long, painful learning curve, stretching over generations, reflects humanity's capacity not just to survive, but to observe, to learn from even the most devastating experiences, and to gradually build defenses against future threats, even if the science took centuries to catch up with the instinct. 4. The paradox of catastrophe. Destruction as a catalyst for change. It feels almost obscene to suggest that anything good could come from a catastrophe as horrific as the Black Death, and we must be incredibly careful not to minimize the unimaginable human suffering it caused. Yet, history often unfolds in complex and paradoxical ways. Immense crises, by their very nature, can shatter old, rigid structures, sometimes creating unexpected openings for new developments, new ways of thinking, and new social dynamics. The Black Death, by drastically reducing the population, inadvertently triggered a series of socio-economic shifts that, in the long run, proved transformative for Western Europe. The acute labor shortage empowered surviving peasants and artisans, leading to higher wages, greater mobility, and the eventual decline of serfdom. It forced innovation in agriculture and technology. It challenged the authority of established institutions like the church and the nobility, simply because they had failed to protect the people or explain the disaster adequately. It created opportunities, born of tragedy, for some women to step into new economic roles. None of this was intended. None of it was worth the price paid in human lives. But it is a historical reality that survivors, in navigating the radically altered world left by the plague, actively and unconsciously began to build something different. The old feudal order, with its rigid hierarchies and lack of social mobility, was fatally weakened, not by a planned revolution, but by the brutal, impersonal force of a pandemic and the subsequent adaptations of those who lived through it. The echo in our times, lessons forged in medieval fire. So, what can we, in our technologically advanced, scientifically enlightened 21st century, possibly learn from the medieval experience of the Black Death? Perhaps more than we think. Their world was vastly different, their understanding of disease almost non-existent by our standards. Yet, the core human responses to overwhelming, existential threats resonate across the centuries. We see their fear, their confusion, their desperate search for answers, and we can recognize echoes of our own anxieties when faced with new pandemics or global crises. We see their attempts at community action, their acts of heroism and sacrifice, like him, and also their moments of social breakdown, scapegoating, and despair, and we can see reflections of the best and worst of human behavior in our own times. Their story underscores the critical importance of knowledge, of science, in understanding and combating threats. Their helplessness in the face of Yersinia pestis is a stark reminder of what life was like before the advent of germ theory, antibiotics, and modern public health. But it also highlights the enduring power of human compassion, the importance of community solidarity, however imperfectly realized, and the sheer grit required to face down the unknown. The Black Death reminds us that we are never truly safe from the microbial world, and that vigilance, preparedness, and a commitment to collective well-being are timeless necessities. The unconquerable human spirit, a legacy of continuance. Ultimately, the story of the Black Death, for all its darkness, is also a story of the unconquerable human spirit. It's a testament to our species' profound capacity not just to survive, but to adapt, to learn, to rebuild, and to find meaning even in the face of almost unimaginable loss. The survivors of the plague didn't just lie down and wait for the end. They mourned their dead, yes, profoundly and deeply. But then they got up, and they started again. They raised new families. They cleared the fields. They re-established communities. They carried the memory of the horror, but they also carried the seeds of the future. Each generation faces its own unique challenges, its own plagues, whether they are literal pandemics, wars, economic collapses, or environmental crises. The specifics change, but the fundamental human task remains the same: to endure, to adapt, to learn, and to strive to build a better world from the lessons of the past. The Black Death was a brutal, agonizing chapter in the human story, but it was not the final chapter. It serves as a powerful, if grim, reminder that even from the deepest abyss, life finds a way, the human spirit finds a way, to continue, to evolve, and to ultimately, against all odds, carry on. That remarkable journey of resilience, etched into our history and perhaps even into our genes, is a legacy worth remembering, and a source of quiet strength as we face the uncertainties of our own times. And that's a wrap on a truly epic journey through one of history's deadliest eras. From the nightmare of the Black Death, we've uncovered tales of unimaginable loss, incredible acts of sacrifice like the village of Im, and even a secret genetic superpower connecting medieval survivors to modern medical miracles. Absolutely mind-blowing, right? If your jaw is still on the floor and you're hungry for more astonishing stories that prove truth is often stranger, and more thrilling, than fiction, then do yourself a favor, hit that subscribe button right now for Thunga's Storytime. We're digging up more unbelievable history and hidden truths every week. You won't want to miss what we uncover next. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next story.
Dàn tới đây luôn á. Lấy máy là quay gửi cho anh Thịnh. Thì chớp nhán nhán được rồi. dàn tới đây luôn á. Lấy máy là quay gửi cho anh Thịnh.
Quay nó có đỏ đâu, không quay lại. Không có đỏ. Nói xịn kìa, chứ nói này quay đâu.
Thì chớp chớp nhán nhán được rồi. á. Lấy máy là quay gỡ cho anh Thịnh.
Quay nó có đỏ đâu, không quay như vậy. Nó không có đỏ. Nói xịn kìa chứ nói vậy rồi đâu.
Thì chớp nhán nhán được rồi. dàn tới đây luôn á. Lấy máy là quay gửi cho anh Thịnh.
quay nó có đỏ đâu, không quay không có đỏ. Má xịn kìa chứ nói này quay đâu.
Thì chớp nhán nhán được rồi. Dàn tới đây luôn á. Lấy máy là quay gửi cho anh Thịnh.